Lakeland Public Television presents Currents with host Ray Gildow. Sponsored by Nisswa Tax Service, offering tax preparation for individuals and businesses across from the City Hall in Nisswa and on the web at nisswatax.com.
Hello, everybody. Hello again, everyone, is what I'm trying to say, and welcome to Lakeland Currents, where we have a pretty exciting topic today with some very exciting people. We're going to be talking about baby boomers and housing and some of the issues that are going to develop as these folks start selling their houses. So today I'd like to introduce Cheryl Hills, who's on my immediate right, who is the Executive Director of the Region 5. We'll talk a little bit about what Region 5 is. Ben Winchester, who is with the University of Minnesota Extension Center for Community Vitality. Welcome to both of you. You've both been here before, but not together.
Right.
So it's your first time interacting in this situation. Before we talk about the topic, maybe Cheryl, could you just give us a little background about Region 5? I know it's been around a long time. I still think there's probably a lot of people that don't know what you do.
Sure, a good secret, right? Region 5 Development Commission serves the 5 counties in central Minnesota of Crow Wing, Cass, Morrison, Todd, and Wadena, and primarily we are a unit of government similar to your cities and counties in state statute, and our function is to act as a planning organization, and we work in the spaces of transportation, community development, and economic development, which are very broad areas, I know, but for our region, our work plan that is set forth by our 22 elected officials focus on things like local foods, energy, broadband, and certainly housing plans, and working with our partners, and a lot of work around transportation. And as I said, we do business lending and technical assistance to small businesses. So that's primarily right where we're at.
Do all counties in Minnesota have a regional?
The 4 counties, the 4 quad counties in the St. Cloud area are working to create one. We are also what is called an economic development district, and that's a term created by the U.S. Department of Commerce. And so in the eyes of EDA, we are one of their children, and those are all over the state of Minnesota. However, the holes in the donut are in St. Cloud. And the West Central Initiative Foundation acts very much like a regional development commission with MnDOT and some of our other partners across the state. And Southern Minnesota Initiative Foundation also does some similar work with EDA that we do. So that the only donut hole right now is the quad counties. I like to tell folks that are from the metro area, the urban areas, that we're the rural equivalent to the Met Council without money and politics.
Without politics?
Without all the politics, right.
Now you have a board.
Correct,
and
right.
Are your board members from each county then?
Yep, cities, counties, townships, school districts, tribes, and then we have special interest groups. So we bring in the workforce, the WIBs, the Workforce Investment Board, higher ed institutions, so Central Lakes College, the chancellor appoints someone to our commission, and a few others that we've kind of pulled in again as special interest groups, like soil and water conservation as a result of water being so connected to economic development. And so,
and you're located in Staples. That's your
right, that's where our
headquarters?
office is, correct.
And how many staff people do you
6.
have on board? And you've been here a while now, haven't you?
Since 2006, correct.
Okay,
Almost
yeah.
a decade. Woohoo.
Good for you.
Yeah.
Ben, let's. This is, I believe, your 3rd time on our show.
Sure.
You've always done a great job, and always have cutting-edge new information. It was kind of interesting because I was watching the paper here this spring, and some of the counties in the area were looking and talking about a topic. I'm not going to break it up again, but that you brought up about a year ago. So they were about a year behind you, but they were using your information,
Right.
your organization's information in their planning. So you've always been just a little bit ahead of the curve when you get here. We appreciate that. But tell us a little bit about your organization and what you do.
Sure. I'm in University of Minnesota Extension. A lot of people know Extension for 4-H, and we do have a really great presence in terms of family and youth development across the state, as well as natural resources and agricultural supports. And we're in kind of, I would say, a newer area of Extension called Community Vitality. And we've got probably 20 or so staff that work in community economics, in leadership, and civic engagement projects across the state.
And you have covered a very broad area in Minnesota. I know personally you've worked in a very large area. And how many people are in the organization doing what you do?
I believe it's me.
It's him.
We do have some other folks that aren't, that don't have the official classification as an educator, but we have other faculty, for instance, that are based on the Twin Cities campus that do research that help support some of the work that we do. And that very much parallels the work I do as a research fellow, in the fact that, you know, we want to bring data-driven decisions. We want to bring some predictable trends to the work that we do and help communities really prepare for their future.
And I think I've found that what's really interesting about your work is that it really is science-based. You're not out there just surmising. You're out there looking at research and trying to make good decisions based on that research, which I think is really important. Nothing stays the same. No communities stay the same. We're all going through these constant changes. And I think a lot of people aren't aware of them if it doesn't impact them directly. Some of the things that we're going to talk about today, if they're baby boomers, it is going to affect them, like death will affect all of us eventually. So the topic of the discussion today is baby boomers and the rural housing supply. But it also interacts into jobs and all kinds of things in our area, which I think is really interesting. So who wants to kick off this discussion?
Ben, I think it'd be great for you too. I want to just mention how important it is and how great it is for regional development commissions and groups doing comprehensive plan with communities or hazard mitigation planning or resilience planning to work with groups like, and certainly take Ben's data and make sure that we're making decisions at that level that are informed by good data. So that might be good to start with, that sort of supply and demand around housing.
That's
right.
Right? Yeah, so this initially started, I like to ask a lot of times basic questions, like who's moving in and who's moving out, or how many leaders do we need in our small towns? And this conversation around housing started when we began hearing more and more about the brain drain that the baby boomers were going to have on the private sector. So as the baby boomers retire, they're going to be leaving their jobs. And what's going to happen to these businesses when we lose all of this knowledge? And the very first thing I think of, being a rural guy, is these people live somewhere. And their homes are going to be put on the market. And I know we're undergoing a tight housing supply in rural Minnesota now, but the data we've got shows that this is going to dramatically change our rural communities in a way that we haven't seen since the mechanization of agriculture. So as we look forward, we need to think about some very predictable data, and here's the case. We know that in rural Minnesota, we have a higher proportion of people age 65 and older right off the bat. And at the same time, we have a higher proportion of people that are baby boomers living in rural Minnesota. And when you look at those numbers, anywhere between 60 to 75% of all the homes in rural Minnesota are owned by baby boomers or older. And so, for example, Aiken County, 32% of the households, owner-occupied households in that county, are owned by people over the age of 65, meaning these homes are probably going to be on the market in the next 5 years. When we think about the baby boomers, we're just on the beginning edge of the baby boomers starting to retire. And we've had some baby boomers take early retirement, some on standard retirement. But people don't necessarily retire and move right away. It may be retire and move 5 years after that point. So as we think about the supply problems that we've got right now, I'm looking forward and seeing nothing but a major supply surplus in the sense that we are going to have a lot of homes going on the market. And I'm not an economist, but I play one on TV. So I'm going to use the term demand. So we look at supply and demand. So on the other side of the supply is a demand. And I've been on your show here before and talked about this migration of people aged 30 to 50, which we call the brain gain of people moving into our rural communities. We do know that there is a national societal preference to live in small towns and rural places if there are homes available.
And jobs.
And jobs. But we do know that with this preference, people haven't been able to move to the rural communities because we've had this housing shortage. So there is one demand piece right there. On the other side, we've seen a great immigrant community move in the past easily 15 years, and some more recent in some of our communities. And this population has a different demand for housing. They may rent. The first generation immigrants generally rent. And it's not until you get into the second and third generation immigrants that they start to have home ownership as a value. And there are some other implications in this that we'll talk about in just a minute. We're also seeing a return to multifamily and multi-generational housing. And this isn't just from the immigrant communities, but we're starting to see this out of the millennials as well. And not just because millennials have high student loans and they watch their parents' house go underwater in terms of their mortgage and some of the other difficulties they've seen, but in a way it's a return to multifamily housing. So when I say multifamily and multi-generational housing, I mean you have more than just the nuclear household where you've got the two parents and their kids and they occupy the entire home. This value really only started to take place in the late 40s, 50s, and 60s. And before then, if you look back in the 19 teens and 20s and 30s, there were multifamily homes all over the place. And then it declined. And we're starting to see a return to multifamily housing. So as we look forward and we think about all these homes that are going to be made available, another thinking point here is that for every 2 homes we have on the market or that will go on the market, there's probably going to be 3 families that can move into those. Where traditionally it would have been 2 families. You have 2 homes, you have 2 households, where really now we're starting to see, again, with this multifamily, multi-generational household, more than 1 family living in a house. So there's kind of all these different trends, both on the supply side, with the baby boomers retiring and wanting a different preference for homes. And this is a whole other topic, which is the seniors want to live in a place that fits their needs. And their 3-bedroom, 2-bath house just is not going to cut it, especially if they want to leave and visit the grandkids for 2 weeks. So we do know that apartments, condos, townhomes, and other kind of opportunities should be made available to them, and they want to live in their community. There's definitely research that shows people want to age in place. But our takeaway is that it doesn't necessarily mean people want to age in their home. So to ensure that people age in their place, we're going to have to gauge this type of demand for preferences that people have that are over the age of 60 or starting to retire. And where do they really want to live? And is there housing available in that community? So these are kind of the deeper questions that we get to. It's a very simple research question with a very complex set of implications behind it.
And I think as part of what we're thinking about is not wanting to displace. Obviously, the intent isn't to say, okay, boomers, get out of your homes so that the millennials can move in and take these jobs and have a place to live when they're ready to. I think it's really about meeting the needs of the population. And how do we plan for that? Because housing stock is such somewhat of a permanent investment, right? It's a huge investment for communities in terms of infrastructure, tax base, and certainly in terms of what the residents themselves need. So it is a complex question as to say, how do all of these data sets help us think about what we have now and our immediate needs now, and how can we make sure that we're transcending those needs into needs for tomorrow? And that's a little harder to do when you're talking about something that is as permanent, particularly since, as we were talking about earlier, that housing isn't the only investment that we make. So we have these secondary impacts that are really important to us in terms of our tax base. And if the boomers move out of those homes, and if it takes a while to have them refilled, what happens to that stock? Does it decrease in value? Is it being kept up? Are we making sure that those homes are in good repair so that they can be resold when millennials want to start moving into those spaces and taking those jobs? So that's I think there's these unintended consequences that we're thinking about. What does that do to our tax base? What does it do to our entrepreneurial development? We know that in economic development, we have people use equity in their homes to start their companies, right? Those entrepreneurs. And if they are not in a place of home ownership during that transition between boomers moving into multifamily or apartments or rental opportunities, or even ownership of condos, how is that going to impact commerce in that stage when we need entrepreneurial investments in our rural communities for prosperity, right? So those are those kind of other issues we think about as impacts, and those are economic impacts and real impacts. Even as we start to think about what the state's doing with dollars that are going towards workforce housing. Well, how much of that needs to be new and how much of that needs to be redevelopment? Or does it need to be invested in multifamily so that we have options for our baby boomers, and again, creating more options with the existing housing stock for our millennials? And so, those are some unintended secondary impacts, right down to the point where it's not just deeds money because of the new money that the state put into workforce housing as of the last session, but it's also dollars that our Minnesota Housing Finance Agency invests in aging in place, and the dollars that they put into the housing stock to make sure that homes have things like telehealth options, right? So that they can age in place and stay in their home a little longer if they so choose to. Ben was saying they may not choose after retirement to move out for 5-10 years. We might want to stay in that home for a little while before we think about a transition home, right? So those investments of telehealth, broadband investments, they're all really, really important to us. But we do need to think about long term and how those investments are used wisely given given this few resources that we have really existing. So
I wonder if we could clarify a couple of things for viewers who might not remember this, but baby boomers would be people born between, what,
1946? 46 and 64.
And millennials?
They're just turning 32, 33 right now.
there's a
on the
generation
upper end.
And
between
how far
there.
back do you
And
go?
then Gen X I'm in the Gen X. I'm in the one in between that nobody ever hears about anymore,
Yeah,
right?
that's
So it's
us.
all about the millennials and the boomers.
Yeah, right.
So the millennials are just turning in their early 30s
Yep,
now?
Yes.
just turning into their 30s.
And what are the earliest millennials?
I believe they're 17, 18, somewhere.
High school.
So, okay, so they're still in high school.
Yep.
All right, and then when you say multifamily, what are you talking specifically besides mom and the kids? Are you talking grandparents?
That would be a multi-generational household where you'd
Okay.
be living with your grandparents, and the grandparents may act as caregivers for the children that you've got in the house too. There's a lot of complexity there and differences in how they look. At the same time, immigrant communities may have multi-families living in a housing unit.
Okay.
So I think there's a lot of nuances to what a household looks like today as opposed to what a household may have looked like in the 50s.
So when you're taking these considerations into thought, if the state's population were to increase significantly, that could offset some of this, could it not? If we get more immigration from the Somali communities or from Hispanic communities, that could affect this.
Yep. And the
But I
immigrant
also understand you're saying that those first generation don't usually buy these homes.
That's right. We do know that in many of our places, the immigrant populations are the reason why the populations are increasing in the first place. And as we look forward in the state, the workforce that's leaving our jobs, we don't have the numbers to replace them. And if they are going to be replaced, it's probably going to be coming from the immigrant communities, not just because of birth rates in the existing population, but because of the situations of who's going to take on those jobs. We've had those conversations in other circles too. So I think it's a good question. It's very complex in terms of like the implications of what housing looks like in the future, but more importantly in the work that Cheryl does is the interconnectedness that housing has to all the different aspects of economic development, community development, housing, you name it, and it's all woven together. And so I think, we learn more and more every week that we think about this data. We learn more and more. And it is more about rather than a narrow view of just say, for example, workforce housing, let's look more broadly at the churn of housing in your community.
Right.
People are selling, people are buying. We need to be cognizant of the fact that people are selling. And there's questions. Are the homes in a condition that you can even get a financeable loan? Some homes, and I know I had a home like this that had knob and tube wiring. You can't get financing for knob and tube. How are we going to ensure the homes are even going to be available and acceptable to a mortgage finance industry? So I think there are a lot of public sector questions to be asked about the private sector as well. And really it's the partnerships between here, the public and the private, that we see as vital to working on this topic.
Now, your research is focusing on rural Minnesota.
That's right.
And is that just pretty much excluding the metro areas of Minneapolis and St. Paul and Duluth, Rochester, those bigger cities? Everything else is considered as part of this study?
Yeah, I do look at the metro counties. It's just not my area of emphasis, I would say. There'll be a report coming out in the next few months here on this housing, baby boomer housing supply, but most of the issues I deal with are about in rural communities where we tend to, again, have a higher proportion of people that are aging than they do in the urban centers. Urban centers also have organizations and private sectors, businesses that are dedicated to supporting them, where we don't have those opportunities. I mean, in many ways, rural communities have had to battle with some of these changes that we see, these globalization changes, with volunteers. And I would argue that we've actually done very well in our rural communities, given the fact that we've undergone major changes in our transportation networks, in our communication networks, in our school systems, in our healthcare facilities, you name it, and we've somehow managed these changes successfully. So as we look forward, I'm very hopeful that our communities are going to come up with the ideas we need moving forward. So that's where, again, my emphasis is mostly on the rural communities because we don't have the private sector there to help think about these issues in depth.
And we are thinking differently. I think that's really important in rural spaces, and even there are areas of the state that have been dealing with housing, significant housing issues from shortages, particularly northwest Minnesota, where the private sector has said we cannot grow as a result of a lack of housing. And we know that that's been a case for a long time in different areas of the state. The private sector has said, how do we play a role in this? Do we need to build housing? Do we need to work with the local units of government to figure out the HRAs, Housing Redevelopment Authorities, to think differently? And so some of the areas of the state are leading the way and have some great lessons to learn as we're thinking about housing in a very comprehensive approach. But we're very blessed in central Minnesota, certainly in this viewer area, to have active builders associations, great realtor associations, wonderful housing redevelopment authorities that are sitting in the same rooms with the private sector to say, how do we work through this, and local units of government. So it is really trying to figure out those creative solutions. Two examples of that, which I think are pretty interesting. One is a project that's been going on and planning in that project and thinking about this housing churn and what's happening and how do we deal with our stock in the Nisswa area, where we've been thinking about a service member housing project. And so targeted to a group, not solely, but targeted to a group that has been identified through market analysis as being underserved in our region, which are active duty and veterans, right? And so how do we make sure that those ancillary services that come with those folks, like maybe all kinds of services, add value to a housing development, a planned unit development. And so, that sort of approach is, and how can, if we build it, it can be useful to future generations and the trends and the data that Ben's bringing to us in terms of multifamily, multi-generational, right? So that's really good that we're actually starting to think differently because of this data. The second project, which is interesting to me, is right here in Crow Wing County, where the Housing Redevelopment Authority, county and city, is working with a Minnesota Housing Partnership and a group of professionals to look at that connection between housing and economic development, economic prosperity, which is job creation and retention, right? So how do those two interface, and what are we doing in thinking about this data, about what kinds of housing is important and for what industries? And so again, whether it's a target population like veterans and active duty service professional folks, or if it is industry specific like Marvin Windows or another technology industry. So that kind of information is really important to us, again, because that investment impacts so many other investments we make in the state of Minnesota, and right down to the community, right down to the city level, and so frankly right down to the downtown area. So that's interesting that we're actually starting to think very broadly about all of the unintended impacts if we do housing the way we have traditionally done it, which is build it and hope they come. And that's certainly different than what we're happening to do now.
That's what's happening in North Dakota with the oil fields. And now they're sitting with empty buildings all around. Second time in the last 20-some years it's happened. So when you work with cities, communities, you're trying to help them understand what's going to happen, and they have to decide if they're going to have policies dealing with that. Do you see housing values dropping significantly because there's going to be less demand for all the people they have moving in behind the baby boomers, or are you not willing to say that?
I mean, obviously, economists will tell you that anytime that supply exceeds demand, price will drop. So it is, the big question is, why should we care about this? And I'll say it's vital that we care about this because we do not want to see our home values drop. It's vital that we care about this because people do want to live in low density environments across the state. It's important that we think about this now because transfer payments, which is another kind of concept area here I want to introduce, is imagine all the dollars funneling into a county, and you can make dollars through jobs that you've got, but you can also generate revenue at the individual level through dividends, interest, rents if you own property. But a major portion is called transfer payments, and these are transfers that are made to individuals from government sources, and this includes old age Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, unemployment benefits, disability, and the one I'm really interested in is old age Social Security. As the number of baby boomers retiring increases, more and more dollars are going to be brought to our rural communities through these transfer payments because people are going to be gathering their old age Social Security payments. These dollars get spent. Almost 100% of these dollars get spent every month. They generate jobs, they generate income, they generate wealth for the community. So the question is, as the baby boomer looks to move to a new home, do you want to lose them or do you want to keep them? Right now, transfer payments make up anywhere between $20 to $25 of every $100 that are made in income in any given rural Minnesota county. And that number will probably bump up to 35%.
Wow.
35% of all your dollars that people make have nothing to do with your jobs. But that 35% generates jobs left and right. So when you think of on the continuum of care, you've got people that need no care, that they're still buying homes, they're still renting, they're still buying groceries, they're still going to the movies, they're still spending on retail sectors. And then as you gain more care, then Medicare could also kick in here, where you're starting your medical and clinical basis for your communities is driven by these dollars. So the question again is, do you want to keep these dollars or do you want to lose these dollars? So why is it important to think of this from a public point of view? It's because if we left it up to the private market, I don't believe the solution is a complex solution. I believe it's a very narrow solution about, is that home going to be sold?
So think about a scenario in Ben's world is to say, maybe the community of Hackensack says, we don't really care if these transfer payments, these folks living on Social Security leave our community or not. We don't really care, right? Like, they would never say that, but if they did, like let them go. And if they did that, the challenge with that is that who will move into those homes so that you have a tax base to deliver services? And if you're planning on those being millennials, they want broadband. So now a community needs to decide that if you want your houses filled and you still want to be a community, are you willing to invest public dollars to provide essential need like broadband?
Did you hear me whisper? We have 1 minute. This is really fascinating information. It really, truly is. I can't believe how fast it went by. We might have to have you guys come back and talk a little bit about this again. Very interesting topic. And it ties into jobs and so many other things that we didn't really get a chance to touch today. Lake homes and all kinds of things. So thank you very much. Very interesting.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
You've been watching Lakeland Currents, where we're talking about what you're talking about. I'm Ray Gildow. So long until next time.